Okay, welcome everybody. Actually, it's just gone to 1 minute past 2, so we give a bit of extra time for people to join. The numbers are still ticking up, but welcome to you all, and good afternoon, morning, evening, depending on wherever you are dialing in from around the world, and welcome to this eDialogue, What Future for Small-Scale Farming? So on behalf of the Sustainable Development Solution Network, of Foresight for Food, of IFAD and APRA, welcome. My name's Ken Giller. I'm co-chair of SDSN's network on sustainable agriculture and food systems, and I'm one of your hosts today. Our network focuses specifically on SDG 2, on the zero hunger SDG, but with very clear links to zero poverty. And when it comes to rural households and smallholder farms in less developed countries, of course, they're absolutely central in our focus. Jim.
Thanks, Ken, and hello everybody. Nice to be joining and connecting on this topic, and we're really thrilled to have the speakers we have with such an experience of what's happening in different parts of the world. I lead the Foresight for Food initiative, which is looking at the longer-term trends around food and agriculture issues from a foresight and scenario perspective, and I'm also an honorary associate at the Food Systems Group at Oxford University, along with a number of other hats. So it's great to have so many people who are interested in this session. Ken. Oh, sorry. Let me just add off that we're kicking off this session today, but we will have a whole series of sessions running between now and the end of, in a very relatively flexible sort of way that will also provide opportunity for others to join in, perhaps run some side sessions, as well as having some vlogs and an online discussion. So we're trying to make this a pretty interactive and engaging process over the next 6 months. So thanks for joining us for this first session. Ken, back to you.
Sure. So first of all, we'd like to try and find out where everybody's dialing in from. So we're going to run a quick poll that Lauren's going to help us with. If you can just click on the poll. It's not for the host and the panelists, this is just for the participants. And I see the numbers are actually sticking up, just still clicking up, so we'll probably miss some people, but just to give us an idea of the geographic reach we've got. So as words of introduction then, our focus, of course, is small-scale farms. Farms run by farmers, rural households, who are absolutely critical to the global food system, as well, of course, for local livelihoods. Now, we'll hear more about them in an introductory talk, hopefully in a few minutes, by the president of the International Fund for Agricultural Development, of IFAD. He's President Gilbert Hougny in a few minutes. But first of all, I just want to give you a bit more background around this eDialogue. Actually, it's an activity that we've been planning for nearly a year or more. And when we were about to launch a conference in March, that was when the COVID-19 crisis struck. And it really knocked us all sideways. I think that's true of us wherever we are around the world. Instead of having then a series of online conferences that we've been running by SDSN and under Foresight for Food, suddenly these stopped being novel events anymore. Everybody was saturated with Zoom calls, Skype meetings, you name it, everything online. So what we did is we stepped back and we took stock and decided instead to try and create an interactive platform through which we strive to hear as many voices and perspectives as possible. So this will be a fully online eDialogue. We'll bring you a series of online discussions, and the first one then today. These will all be recorded and they'll be available on the internet. In addition, we'll be having interviews with people, virtual workshops backed up by blogs, by vlogs, video blogs, an e-discussion group where people can put in their ideas and share documents, and other side events. But we're aiming then to run towards the final wrap-up workshop at the end of November. And the timing's there for a couple of reasons. One is that we want to feed our findings into the 4th International Global Conference on Global Food Security. That's taking place in December, hopefully in person, partly in Montpellier and also online. and also into the Rural Development Report for 2021 of IFAD, which I and Jim and others are involved in supporting currently. And the outcomes of that will be made available for the 2021 Food Systems Summit. So we think we'll run this from now until November. There we'll try and close off this dialogue, but we'll definitely be using all of the input that you provide in future. So we've got a format that we try and make open and fluid. And if you've got ideas of how we can engage and stimulate debate on this really important topic, then do please get in touch with us. Now, this first event then is really to try and set the scene as we move into the next sessions. And so in future, we'll be drawing on many more contributors. Now, first of all, maybe we can just check the results of the poll, Lauren. So great. So we've got 50% from Europe, but 35% from Africa, 8% from Asia, nobody from Australasia. Maybe that's a problem with the timing. Of course, we've got Jim here representing Australia, maybe. Nobody from Latin America and the Caribbean currently, and very few from the Middle East, but a good representation then from Africa and Europe, less from Asia. Without further ado, I would like to hand over to Gilbert Hougny. Has he been able to join yet?
He apparently he is online, but I'm not quite sure why we're not in the speakers area. Lauren, can you see if you can do something about that?
Is he joined with a different name? Because I don't see him as an attendee or a speaker.
Would he be joining under Soledad's name?
No.
These things always happen.
I wonder if on the IFAD side, you could just write a note in the chat box about the situation.
Or if you can find the raise hand feature, at the bottom of the Zoom window, there is a 3-dot icon that says more, and it should let you raise your hand. Whatever name he's joined under, I can find you that way.
Sorry about the hiccup, everybody. I see people are introducing themselves and saying hello in the chat box, so feel welcome to do that. We'll be using the chat box as well for your questions later on as we move forward. And we've got Lauren Beredo and Linda Velthausen who are helping actually to collect questions that we can feed back into the discussion later on. If we are going to be delayed, though, what we might want to do, and I think it's a pity because we wanted the general introduction then to come from IFAD, but what I might like to do then is, otherwise, Jim, is I hand over to you and maybe we go ahead directly with our other list of speakers, and then we flip back to Gilbert if and when he manages to get online.
I think maybe I just promoted him.
Okay.
I'm hoping that IFAD is the person who has joined as the loan signing room. And this wasn't
yeah.
Oh, great.
Yes.
Okay.
Ah, perfect. Great.
Perfect.
Sorry. If you'd like to share your camera, is it?
Now it's on.
It's on, Ken.
Okay, go ahead. Jim, I hand over to you to chair the next session. And
Okay.
Thank you.
We cannot zoom now because we are using this one. We can only zoom.
Right. Thank you, and welcome, President Gilbert Hougny. It's a real pleasure to have you with us, and we very much appreciate your time for joining us. And apologies for some of the difficulties of working in this virtual world and avoiding Zoom bombing. I think what we'll do, we have everybody online. I think we have nearly 100 participants at the moment, and we did have over 300 registrations. So I think there's a tremendous amount of interest in this. Without further ado, Gilbert, can I hand it to you to welcome us all to this dialogue and to give your thoughts on the future of small-scale agriculture?
Thank you so much. First of all, let me apologize. I've been here listening to you for the last 10 minutes or so, but unfortunately you cannot hear me and you cannot see me, while I can see Jim and hear all the ongoing discussion. So I'm sorry about that. Dear colleagues, allow me to use a few words to welcome you to this first interactive session. Launching this eDialogue series on the future of small-scale farmers. In fact, some of you are very much familiar with this. We are quite very pleased to join other partners in bringing greater attention to such an important topics. The role of small-scale producers has always been key to global food security. But now, more than ever, with the COVID pandemic disrupting movement, trade, food production, we really need to focus on the small-scale producers and put them at the center of our thinking. And the recent SOPI report, which I'm sure you have already gone through, the recent SOPI report just confirmed why we should do so. The pandemic follows 5 years in which food insecurity was already increasing. But this crisis, if it has revealed one thing, is just how precarious many livelihoods, including those of small-scale producers and other rural people. It is predicted that between 83 and 132 million more people could go hungry as a result of this pandemic in 2020. And because most of the world's poorest people live in rural areas, that is where the threat is greatest. Poor rural people are especially vulnerable and also very marginalized, as we know. The SOPI report states that 57% or more of the population cannot afford a healthy diet throughout sub-Saharan Africa or Southern Asia. Due to high prices, a healthy diet is more than 5 times as costly as a starchy diet that meets only calorie needs. As a result, 3 billion people cannot afford these healthy diets. Let's think a moment about what that number really means, 3 billion. This is a problem of equity and availability as much as of production and productivity. Without an inclusive transformation of our food systems, the most vulnerable people will continue to be left behind. The small-scale producers have the available labor to produce many of the healthy crops needed for a nutritious diet. Increasing healthy food production and market supply will improve producers' own livelihoods and also lower prices of healthy food for everyone. The livelihoods of some 2 to 3 billion of the world's poorest people are still highly connected to producing and selling food. So to succeed, rural transformation needs to be inclusive, need to be addressing the specific need of vulnerable groups such as women, youth, indigenous people, people with disabilities, and other vulnerable groups. The COVID-19 crisis demands that we rethink how we can invest in a more sustainable and equitable future. When we consider also the devastating effect of climate change on vulnerable small producers, this agenda is even more pressing. Never has it been more important to build the resilience of rural people, because when crisis strikes, the poor and the vulnerable bear a disproportionate burden. Historically, global recessions and crises have tended to inflict the greatest harm on the poorest and the most vulnerable segment of the society, and this one is no different. The rural people have little margin to weather this crisis. Globally, at the country level and down to the level of local communities, we are all going to have to think creatively about how to design food systems that are economically inclusive, enable good nutrition, and function within environmental limits. With that in mind, I really would like to welcome this eDialogue as a way to encourage deeper thinking about the future of small-scale agriculture within a transformed food system. We hope to bring together ideas and knowledge from across the world, integrating the experiences of farmers with the insights from the latest research and analysis. The eDialogue is also timely in that it can contribute to the 2021 Food System Summit, which will seek to advance concrete actions to promote equitable access to nutritious food and better livelihood. I would like to thank you for your participation and look forward to the development of the dialogue we are initiating here today. Thank you so much. Over to you.
Gilbert, thank you very, very much for those opening words and outlining so well some of the challenges that we face. I think you've put on the table here essentially three interacting crises that really link with small-scale agriculture. The broader nutrition crisis, which of course affects wide populations, a poverty crisis, and I think in the context of the COVID-19, a sort of an emerging vulnerability crisis. And I think what you're giving us is a really important challenge about how we understand these problems, but more importantly, in your own words, how do we think much more creatively about how to actually solve these challenges moving forward in the context of the challenge that's been set to us all about the upcoming Food System Summit. So thank you very, very much for joining us this afternoon and opening this session for us. We appreciate it very much and look forward to being able to report back to you on what comes out of the dialogue over the coming months. I'm not sure if you need to run off or whether you'll be listening to the speakers for a little while or not.
I shall be here for a little while, and then I'll have to rush maybe half hour or so.
Okay, that's great. So if you'd like to intervene at any other point, please feel free to do so. How we've structured the speaking session now is to get somewhat of a perspective from each of the three regions, because while we realise many of the problems affecting small-scale agriculture do have commonalities across different parts of the world, we're also pretty aware that there's also very big different regions. So we're going to have these regional perspectives. We also bring apologies that due to the problems in Ethiopia, our speaker from the African Union isn't able to join us, but thankfully we've got two other speakers that can jump in and give us a perspective on the agriculture story there. So what I'd like to do is to jump over to Milieu Mayunga, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Agriculture and Food Resource Economics at Michigan State University. Tremendous amount of experience from across agriculture, particularly with value chains, and done a lot of very interesting work on the sort of link between alternative incomes and small-scale agriculture. So we'll hand over to you and ask you to sort of prompt us with what you see as some of the really big emerging issues for small-scale agriculture across the African continent. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Jim, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are. I will take my minute to talk a little bit about smallholder farming in Africa. Of course, that's the continent where I work. So I may not talk much about smallholder farming in other continents of the world. To get me off the door, I would want to mention that smallholder farming constitutes bulk of farming communities in Africa, representing over 60% of agricultural producers in sub-Saharan Africa. And the most unfortunate thing is most of them are poor and are food insecure. We've been told that a smallholder-led strategy is the best to get these people out of poverty. We've read the works of Johnston, Melo. Yeah, they all talk about, you know, a smallholder-led growth strategy. And it's for some obvious reasons, because we know that, you know, a growth that starts from a small group of people may not benefit. You know, it might not be very inclusive. And again, it is known that growth starting with smallholder farmers is likely to be to offer growth linkages and multiply effects. While we are on this, I have a question here about you know, whether smallholder-led strategy is still possible in Africa, considering the problems that we've had. You know, most of them are historical problems that we've had since independence in 1960s in Africa. And again, we have some problems that are coming up. And again, I want to mention that when I say 60% of smallholder farming, you know, our farming population in Africa is smallholder farmers, I don't mean that the distribution of smallholder farming is evenly, you know, within these countries. For example, what we note is that when you look at land distribution, you know, going from country to country, you will find that it varies a lot. In some countries, you will find that maybe over 60% of the farmland is in the hands of smallholder farmers. In some other countries, majority of the land could be in the hands of the medium-scale farmers. And by medium, I mean farms measuring 5 hectares to 15, depending on which country you're talking about. So in other countries, like where I'm currently based in Malawi, you will find that, you know, farmers who operate less than 1 hectare constitute almost 80% of the farming community in that particular country. So, you know, when you look at smallholder farmers across African continent, they vary. It's not just like an homogeneous group. Well, the question I have for us today is, you know, like to ask whether farms have become too small in Africa to generate that much awaited smallholder-led growth. And I would think if we continue waiting any longer, the situation might not even get any better. So I would want, for the remaining time, I would want to run you quickly through some of the challenges that we have in Africa, the ones which are known and the ones which are emerging, complicating the already complicated process. We have always known that you know, agriculture in Africa suffers from low productivity. We basically rain-fed with one growing season, and then very limited irrigation. And then these problems are compounded by other problems, which I don't want to throw blames, but I would say there are more policy problems. And these basically are inadequate investment in soft, what I would call soft and hard infrastructure. And by soft, I mean in terms of policies. We've had a problem in some countries where we have an unpredictable policy environment, which kind of affects investment in agriculture, coordination between the public and private investments, then lack of inclusive policy-making processes, whereby most of the time the voices of the private sector and the civil society are excluded. And in terms of hard infrastructure, I would mean investment in roads, railways, water supply, and all that. Then besides those problems that are known, we have others, which the first speaker talked about, emerging mega threats, problems which are facing the continent. So they are adding another dimension to the already complicated situation in Africa. And one of them is the mounting population densities. We know that while population growth has kind of slowed down in other countries, in other continents, in Africa, it's on the upward trajectory. And population growth is coming with its own problems. And one of them is closing land frontiers. We see shrinking farm sizes, as I've talked about, smaller land sizes in most of the African countries. And then we are also seeing unsustainable forms of agricultural intensification as soils become extremely tired because of continuous use without fallowing, and also becoming too acidic because of continuous use of inorganic fertilizers on soils that are low on soil organic carbon. I know Ken has written much about this, Chris Barrett, and the rest. Then another problem that is associated with mounting population densities has to do with the youth bulge, B-U-L-G-E. Yeah, what we find is that in Africa, majority of the population is under the years 24 years and below. That is almost actually 2/3. And as we all know, this can be a blessing or a curse depending on how the situation is handled. Time allowing, I may want to come back to this and try to talk about it a little bit more. And then we also have, of course, the market environment, which we know is very unstable and very uncertain with the liberalization policies of 1980s. And then we have the climate change and urbanization, which is basically happening in some countries too slowly to stabilize farmland, and in other countries too fast for African countries to cope with. So those are basically the issues I would want to talk about. And moving forward, maybe I'll chime in and, kind of add more into what I've already talked about. So maybe I may want to stop there, Mr. Chair.
Miliu, thank you so much for that. And I think you really pointed out some of the, I guess, the overall complexity of these issues about the actual status of farmers themselves, but how that connects to wider policy, the wider environment. And I think trying to bring some of those connections together is what we're really trying to do in this dialogue as we move forward. So we'll look forward to hearing a little bit more from you later in the discussion this afternoon. But with that, let me turn to another African perspective from Jimana Yukie, who's a senior program specialist at Canada's International Development Research Centre, but also has a huge range of experience in agriculture and rural development issues in Africa, with a particular focus on gender and youth in agribusiness. So, Jimana, let me hand over to you to give a little bit of your perspective on where you see small-scale agriculture heading in Africa. What are the big challenges? What do we need to be thinking about to make this creative thinking, or to actually solve problems that Gilbert sort of gave us the challenge of? Over to you, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Jim, and thanks for the invitation. So glad to be here and to see so many of you joining the conversation. I'm gonna pick up just from where Milu stopped and say 4 key things. The first one is, who are smallholder farmers? Because we've had a tendency of generalizing and thinking this is a group of homogeneous people that are facing similar constraints, and for who the path to growth or the path to food systems transformation is going to be similar. And I think we need to nuance that a bit if any proposals, including some of the global challenges that the IFAD president has put on the table, are to be addressed. So the first thing, smallholder farmers are not equal, and I think Milu has said this when he talked about land sizes and which categories, what proportion of smallholder farmers are holding how much of land. And I think of them in 3 groups. We have smallholder farmers that are commercial. They have access to resources, they have linkages to markets, and all that those kinds of farmers really need are conducive policies that enable them to thrive. The second category is smallholder farmers who we know have potential, but they are struggling with issues of productivity. They're struggling with issues, as Milu said, of depending on rain-fed agriculture, on small plots of land, but where we still see huge potential to commercialize and to enable those, that group of farmers to actually make a living out of agriculture, and not just a basic living, but actually earn a living wage from agriculture. And a lot of the interventions there need to be around how do you increase access to technologies? How do you organize marketing in ways that work for these farmers? And then we have a category, a third category of farmers that farm as a way of living, very small land sizes. They plant, they harvest, they eat, no surpluses. And where the interventions or policy approach there should be around social protection. And so we need to have a much better policy nuance of what approaches and what is going to work for different kinds of smallholder farmers. The second thing I want to say is around, and Milu mentioned this as well, that the demographic of African farmers is changing. I am still hearing in a lot of reports, a lot of conversations, that the average age of the African farmer is 60. And I think this is a challenge with our data and how we collect data, that more young people are going into agriculture. But the support systems for the young people in agriculture still aren't working. You will hear a lot being said about making agriculture sexy. Let's make agriculture cool so that youth can join. I've never had a conversation about making accountancy sexy, and yet we still have young people who are accountants. So what's the bigger challenge we have in terms of young people in agriculture? It is how we make agriculture make money and how we nuance the policies and support that we give to young people, but also how we start collecting better data about who our farmers are. Because in a country, the moment you know who your farmers are, what they have, what the challenges are, which category they fit in, then you can tailor support to them in better ways. The third thing I want to talk about is a lot of the perverse incentives that I see in the agriculture sector. I live in Kenya, and every time we have a food shortage, we talk about, we need to import food, or we need to invest in large scale government funded and government managed firms, rather than really going back to seeing what is the contribution of smallholder farmers to food production and in the country, and how can we best support that sector to grow. Of course, with a lot of the caveats that Milu was talking about in terms of, are we gonna see a food systems transformation that's driven mainly by smallholder farmers or not? The fourth and last thing I wanna say on this is where we put, and this is related to the perverse incentives as well. We place a huge focus on improvements in yield, and yet we have a lot of food that is going to waste through post-harvest losses, and we do not see enough investments there. How can we use data to actually drive policy and programming into areas where interventions are needed most? I was just reading a report from McKinsey saying, of course, you can add about 350 million tons into in Africa through yield improvements if you look at, especially around cereals, but there's a whole other potential for saving about 50 million tons of food through reductions in post-harvest losses, and how we figure out really where to put the investments. One of the things that Jim didn't say is that my research in the last 20 years in the region has been around gender and women in agriculture. And so I would like to say one or two things about that. So we know, people always say this, when we talk about women in agriculture, it is at the last of the sentence that says vulnerable groups, especially women. And so just to talk about, you know, the women are important actors in the smallholder agriculture sector as producers, as traders, as people who are moving food from rural areas to urban areas and providing offtake and markets, as processors that are adding value to food. And so we need to recognize this critical role that women play, because they are really important for the transformation of the smallholder agriculture space. One of the questions, of course, that we always ask is their role, how much are they contributing? And it has almost seemed as though women are the problem themselves. When we talk about all the farms that they manage, that they control, have lower productivity, they are cultivating on smaller farms, let's train them, let's organize them. So a lot of the interventions around supporting women in agriculture have focused on women themselves. And one of the things we've been doing in IDRC is to actually flip that question and say, as we transform food systems, as we transform smallholder agriculture, how do we ensure that that transformation is empowering for women? How do we focus on women's leadership in the sector? How do we increase their access to resources and technologies, to extension systems? But how do we also ensure that they are in leadership positions where they are actually part of the decision-making processes? And so we have what we now call a gender transformative food systems framework that we are testing across countries in our programming. And the last thing I want to say about that, I see Jim is back on, probably my time is out, is that there's a lot of myths about women in agriculture that we need to get rid of, because they're stopping us from collecting the data that's needed to make the right policy decisions about supporting women. And I'm very glad to be part of a technical committee now with IFAD, the World Bank, and the International Food Policy Research Institute, developing a national metric for measuring the empowerment of women in agriculture, so that we can start getting better data that informs us in terms of what priority actions are needed to make sure that we get to a gender transformative food system. So thank you, Jim. And unfortunately, I'll be leaving after this because I have to join another meeting, but it's been great being part of this conversation.
Jim, you are muted.
Jim, you're muted.
I'm so sorry. We all make these blunders with this virtual world, don't we? even though I've been on this Zoom stop the last 2 days. Apologies for that. Jimima, thanks so much for your input. Very insightful points there. And I think you really emphasized one of the things we really wanted to stress in this series is about the need to sort of disaggregate who we're talking about. I mean, talk about the real people that we're thinking about when we think about small scale farmers, but also in terms of gender differentiation, but their size and their circumstances and what that means for a different sort of policy mix. So with that, I think it'd be really interesting to move over to Julio Berge and Julio, hear a perspective from you about what you see as the big issues in Latin America, perhaps pointing out where you maybe see some differences with the African side. And I know just before we all came online, you were talking about the devastating impacts of COVID, which I think also sort of illustrates one of the things that we really need to be understanding. So we look forward to your input.
Thank you, Jim. I want to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to meet with you and share ideas about the future of smallholder agriculture, or family farming, as we tend to call it in this region. When this painting was painted in 1948, 47 actually, by the Mexican painter Diego Rivera, the world had just ended World War II. FAO had been created only 2 years before. And in Latin America and the Caribbean, the rural population was around 60%, which is more or less the rate that we find today in sub-Saharan Africa. Agriculture was very much the central arena of livelihoods of most people. 62% of all Mexicans were food insecure. 89% of them lived in poverty, which probably meant that every peasant, every smallholder farmer was probably poor. However, these farmers were quite autonomous and independent, as they lived in local communities, quite isolated from the broader world, and their livelihood was certainly centered around agriculture, which of course was the dominant sector in the economy as a whole. A few years later to our present world, and food systems are very, very different from the world only 50 years ago or 70 years ago. Where is agriculture now? Where is the smallholder now in this very, very complex modern food system, which has spanned the whole world in different magnitudes, in different regions, for sure, but always in the same trend, I believe. Now, there is a question whether smallholders have a future in this very, very different new world of food systems. Well, this is some data from Chile. Chile is probably one of the most liberalized economies in the developing world. Very open markets, very competitive, very little support. And yet we see that over the last several decades, smallholder families or family farmers have done relatively quite well in Chile, both in terms of numbers. Of course, it's been decreasing as it's normal and natural, but at a slower rate than the decrease in the number of commercial farmers. Relative to their starting point, the income of smallholder farmers has increased at a much faster rate than the total income of commercial farmers, which in fact has tended to decrease. So this shows that in the Latin American context, smallholder farmers can do quite well or relatively well in this very new complex world of modern food systems. So there's always been a question, should we build bridges or should we build walls to protect smallholders from this, what appears to be a very menacing world out there? The question is, bridges to what? And the first comment I want to make, strong point I want to make, is that often we're building bridges to the wrong place, or not the wrong place, but places which are not the fundamental places for the majority of smallholder farmers. For example, we put a lot of attention to building bridges to agri-food processors and to supermarket chains and to niche markets. We've done a review of the corporate reports of the 27 largest agri-food processors in the world, who represent about 90% of all agri-food processing in the world, and the top 25 supermarket chains in the world, which represent essentially almost all supermarket chains sales in the world, food sales. Also, we've seen the reports of the organizations of organic farmers and fair trade farmers, and we find that taking all of these niche markets, specialized markets, they only serve a very, very tiny proportion of smallholders. We're, on the other hand, placing very little attention and very little support in improving the real markets, where most 98, almost 99% of the smallholder farmers of the world continue to operate. So we need to be sure that we're building bridges to the right places in order to support the vast majority of smallholder farmers. The future of family farmers in Latin America depends on the changes in the context in which they live and work. We tend to focus a lot, and it's correct to focus a lot, on building the capacities of smallholder farmers. But we don't do enough in improving the environments and expanding the environments in which these smallholder farmers live and work. And it's not enough to build the capacity of the smallholder if we don't improve the environment in which they live and work, because this environment can be very conducive or it can be very toxic, regardless of how much we invest in technology or finance, etc., in the smallholder, him or herself. So how can we improve this environment? Well, there's many ways, but I would like to prioritize 4 ways. First, we need to seriously advance digitalization. Perhaps this is the cheapest and most efficient way in which we can connect millions of smallholder farmers to a larger environment. Second, very traditional, but extremely effective, we need to continue to improve rural roads. Improved rural roads make a big difference, a huge difference in the life of smallholder farmers and their households. A smallholder farmer can link to the market using digital means, for sure, but the potatoes that he or she sells to that market still need to travel through an actual road. And in Peru, that increases by 14% the cost of his or her potatoes. So we need to improve rural roads. Third, as I said, we need to really make a big effort in improving the real markets in which the vast majority of smallholders operate. It's okay, niche markets, specialized markets, I have nothing against them. It's extremely very good, very useful for the about 2% of smallholder farmers in the world who link to those specialized markets. But we need to focus on the markets in which 98% of the smallholders in the world operate. And these are the traditional markets, and we've sort of forgotten about them. Finally, very, very important, we need to improve agency, the capacity of smallholders and rural peoples to change their local environments. This means improving local governance and investing in the development of coalitions of rural people and smallholders that can lead transformative change in the places where they live and work. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I'm 1 minute over the time you gave me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Julio. Again, some really focused points on thinking about the future. I'm wondering if I could just ask you a couple of quick follow-up questions on that. I mean, one is coming back to what we were talking about at the beginning of the discussion, is how much of small-scale farmers' incomes are coming off the farm, and what does that mean in sort of a balanced policy to deal with that issue? Because I think we were talking about that in terms of the vulnerability of farmers from the COVID situation of losing external income. So how do you see the future of small-scale agriculture in more diversified livelihoods, and what does that mean for the way one needs to think about the issues you were just talking about? Oh, you're on mute,
Yeah.
Julio.
We know, and we've known for many, many years, that in all regions of the world, not just in Latin America and the Caribbean, also in Asia, also in Africa, the share of the income of smallholders households that comes from non-farm sources is increasing. And in many of these regions, it's also more than half of the total income. Now, that doesn't mean that many of these smallholder farmers leave agriculture. I think that this non-farm rural income is part of the reason why in countries like Chile, they continue to survive, exist, and operate and do quite well. It's a combination of agriculture and non-agricultural income that gives them the resilience that they need. So I don't see there's any contradiction between the growth in non-farm income and the continued development of smallholder farmers.
Okay. And what I'm assuming in terms of you're saying about focusing on the real markets to which smallholders contribute, is you're seeing sort of informal, semi-formal markets remaining as a huge proportion of the food supply system in most parts of the world for a considerable period of time.
Of course.
Yeah.
I mean, it is the case, you know, and yet, you know, we're spending a lot of money and giving a lot of attention to, you know, linking with the Unilevers and the Walmarts and the Tescos of the world, which is perfectly fine. I have no objection to that. But we need to do much more in the local markets, the village markets, the wholesale markets, these very complex network of markets, which is where the vast majority of smallholder farmers work. We've forgotten about that. It's a very difficult, it's a very, very difficult challenge, but it's absolutely essential.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Julio. And I know you won't be able to stay with us till the end, but we thank you very much for your contribution. And I think that was a great challenging input perspective. And we hope that we can maybe come back to you as the dialogue unfolds over future sessions. So again, thank you so much. With that, let's move on to a perspective from Asia, in particular South Asia, with Avinash Kishore, who's a researcher with IFPRI. I've worked with Avinash quite a lot over the last few years and are always astounded by his sort of encyclopedic knowledge of everything to do with agriculture and small-scale agriculture across the region. So Avinash, we're really pleased to have you join us this afternoon to give us a little bit of a perspective on how you see these issues playing out across your part of the world. Now, what are the really big issues there? And do you see some big differences or big similarities in terms of what you've heard in terms of the stories from Africa and Latin America?
Thanks, Jim. Thanks a lot for this opportunity. Actually, I was surprised by how many similarities there are in concerns that the three speakers before me expressed. Even though you would imagine a family farmer in Latin America would be a very, very large farmer by the South Asian scale. But many of the issues that he raised are similar in South Asia and India. So and the title of the session was Trends, Challenges and Opportunities. So I just want to list the four that I thought of, and I would list them first in case I run out of time. And just to avoid duplication, because there are similarities between the other two regions that we heard about, I would just go more macro, and hopefully it would still make sense. So first trend that we are seeing, and I think this is also across multiple regions, and that has a lot of different implications that I will, if time permitting, talk about, is the rising gap between agricultural and non-agricultural incomes. It is increasing in the entire South Asia region. Farmers' income versus non-farmers' income, ag GDP versus non-ag GDP, growths are very different, and it's diverting, and it has multiple implications. The second, which is, I think, more specific to South Asia or countries like Malawi, as we heard, is this either shrinking or at least persistence of ultra small holdings. Small holding doesn't even make sense now. In my home state, we are talking about 0.1 hectare and 0.2 hectares. That's the areas that we are talking about. Everyone in South Asia is a smallholder pretty much. The third that I want to talk about, which I'm sure all of us agree to, is depletion of all natural resources that we care about. Soil, water, now in South Asia, even air because of agriculture, and of course, biodiversity. That also is a trend that I think poses a lot of challenges, and we need to find opportunities to reverse it. And the last one, because we are all living through this pandemic, it's not a trend, but it's a kind of a hope. One has to be optimistic. Is that hopefully, since this problem was started apparently by unsafe food or unsafe food processing, there will be greater demand even in countries like India and Bangladesh, and greater concern for food safety, like safer production, safer processing, and safer consumption and disposal of food and food waste. So let me just go over all the four challenges. So first is, why did I raise this rising gap between farm and non-farm incomes? We know it's happening. I think there are multiple reasons, but two that I would point out is one is that we are not able to move, at least in South Asia, enough people out of agriculture. So that's why the ag share in employment continues to be high, but share in GDP has been declining. So that's one of the reasons why I think the gap continues to widen. The second, which is someone alluded to earlier from Africa, is that in these countries where there are far more consumers than producers, I guess everywhere else, and food is a big part of household budget, especially for the poor, governments cannot allow prices to rise. So farmers often, Julio was talking about toxic environment. Part of the toxic environment is that food prices are never allowed to rise. They are allowed to crash, but they're never allowed to rise. So that, in a sense, to subsidize non-farm sector and consumers, they're keeping farm prices rise. Michael Lipton talked about it in 1950s, 60s. It's not a new problem, but it's a persistent thing. So what's the associated challenge? One of the challenges that as the gap between farm and non-farm incomes increase, no one wants, if you really ask, like no one wants their kid to be in agriculture. They are in agriculture because they don't have options. They don't want to be their kids to be in agriculture. If you want to have sustainable agriculture, why would I invest in sustainable agriculture if I don't see any future for myself? I would rather extract more resources, build that surplus, and use that surplus to invest in occupational diversification, to education, training, migration, whatever it is. I think that's a very important challenge that we don't talk about. Are there any opportunities? One of the opportunities, in a weird way, that it creates is that you have a richer urban or even within rural areas non-farm class whose consumption patterns are different, whose high value food consumption, etc., are going up, and that allows even very small farmers to cater to their needs and maybe have some hope of having a living income out of really, really small economy. But then what do we do to leverage this opportunity that is there? And again, referring back to Julio's point, I think one trend that is there in this region is that there is more, within the food economy, there's more value creation happening, faster value. The off-farm food economy is growing much faster than the on-farm one. So in India, in last 5-6 years, the ag GDP increased by 2%. If you look at the value added by food enterprises, which includes everything, was 8-10%, right? So there's a lot of value creation. Then the challenge for smallholders is how do we get a larger share from this value creation that is happening not on farm? How do we get a larger share for the smallholder of this value creation that is happening off farm? And I think there's one model in India that is celebrated, the Amul Dairy, the White Revolution model, where farmers own not just the production part, but also the processing, the marketing, and the brand. And that gets them 80% of the consumer's price. Challenge there would be, it's not easy to replicate Amul's, even for milk, leave alone for other commodity. And that's the challenge that I think we need to grapple with in times to come. The second is the shrinking or persistence of smallholders. What does this trend apply? This trend implies that the traditional market that Julio was talking about, you have every farmer has very small surplus, and it's a challenge to earn a living wage of the agriculture, especially in this era when everyone has rising cash expenditure, right? Even a farmer is spending money on data, etc. And one thing that I want to point out about traditional markets, etc., is that you hear about a lot of new schemes and plans to increase farmers' share of money. But as I studied market in South Asia, I think there are no low-hanging fruits there. Yeah, and two things, we also talk about policy engineered land consolidation or market land consolidation where holdings will consolidate. I think that's not the Asian model. Chinese land holdings, Vietnamese land holdings are even smaller than South Asian. So our holdings will be small. And what we will need is better institutional models or innovations to reduce the gap between consumer and producer prices. But I want to alert that there aren't any easy quick fix solutions. The markets have picked up the low-hanging fruits that were there to be. Given the infrastructural limitations and other limitations, these much blamed, much maligned informal markets do a pretty good job. And improving upon them would be a challenge given the situation of diffuse production, small producers, and not that rich consumers. The third is, of course, well known, the all-round resource depletion. The challenges here is that you have policies and programs. Every country in the region has policies or programs for sustainable intensification of agriculture. But if you look at if you follow the money, every country in the region also has 100 times more budget allocation for some program or set of programs that is directly hurting the environment, that's directly incentivizing unsustainable agriculture, be it cheap electricity, subsidized fertilizer, etc. And it's not only India, it's in other countries too. And it's very difficult to reverse these policies, populist or subsidy policies in democratic setups. I guess even in authoritarian setups, but more so in democratic setups. But that said, there is one opportunity that is emerging with this digital infrastructure improving and unique IDs, etc. Governments in the region are also exploring, and India at least has moved a long way in moving towards direct cash transfer to support farmers. As long as the gap between farmers and non-farmers keeps widening, there will be popular pressure to support farmers if there are a large number of farmers, right? So governments are moving at least a few steps in the direction of direct cash transfers and income support to farmers instead of distortionary subsidies, subsidizing inputs, etc. That gives me some hope that maybe over next year, as these trends become stronger, we will have farmer support, which we need, but without distorting or destroying the environment. The last one that I'm going to talk about is this. I'm hoping that with this risen awareness and thinking about food safety, not always on the radar, there will be greater willingness, there will be greater concern, and hopefully greater demand for safer food. But there's a challenge. I worry that Indian state overestimates, and South Asian states overestimate their capacity. They do not realize that money is not the scarcest resource in the region, though we are poor. It's the state capacity, the bureaucratic time, which is the scarcest resource. India, for example, has 150 million producers, farmers, I mean, and I just recently analyzed some data, 20-25 million food enterprises, each is tiny. Any regulator, go ask any regulator, even in the most developed part of the state, regulating 21 million users is like regulating tailpipe emissions from cars, right? Carbon emissions from cars. It will be impossible. We'll never have the kind of state capacity where we can regulate the behavior of 150 million producers. Each is tiny, most of them are informal, have very little connection with the state. So what I want to, through this forum, I want to impress upon any policymakers listening to it, that while we should regulate, improve our regulations regarding food safety, I think we need to work through behavioral change communication and campaigning for raising awareness and interest. I think penalties and regulations are not going to get us safer food. First-party enforcement, awareness and greater interest, and supporting people who are interested in changing their behavior, changing their business practices. That's what something, a bureaucratic way, a heavy-handed top-down manner where we pass new regulations. We do need safe food. Everyone wants safer food. But for this reason, where the food system is organized very differently, with millions of very small producers and processors scattered over vast countrysides, we need to take a different approach compared to, let's say, what many other countries have taken in the past or today's developed countries. Those are the 4 trends that I wanted to talk about. Thanks a lot for this opportunity. Over to you, Jim.
Lovely, thank you so much, Avinash. And again, a really interesting set of additional perspectives. So I think if we think across all of the speakers we've now had, we're actually getting a very rich set of materials and challenges and issues to take forward. And I think, you know, bringing in the critical need to think about the natural resource space behind this, the food safety issue, and I guess the reality that there perhaps aren't easy solutions to all of this, but which brings us back to the point that Gilbert introduced in the beginning about how do we think much more creatively and in a more forward-thinking way about these sorts of challenges. Thank you so much to all of our speakers for what I think has been an incredibly rich and diverse scene setting, which I think gives us a very, very good base to move forward in the next sessions of these dialogues. And with that, let me hand over to Ken to ask our speakers some questions and to respond to some of the questions and issues that are emerging in great depth in the chat bar.
Sure. Well, I mean, my first point is a reminder I have in front of me is that I have to remind you that you can submit questions through the chat box in the attendee control panel. There are actually 2 ways. One's a question and answer box, which is actually, I think, easier if you just put the questions into the chat box. We'll be collecting all of these, and we've got to find some way of responding to them all, because we won't be able to cover them all in the coming 20 minutes or so that we've got left. I personally was really triggered by so many different things, and particularly for me, I think this as Avinash just mentioned, you know, the resonance, if you like, in some of the issues coming from Africa, Latin America, and Asia. I always had a feeling that Latin America was different, but Julio raised so many things which I think in a very thoughtful way, which actually fit in the other areas. Now we've got one other panelist that we'd invited along to join the discussion because of Jimima and Julio both had a clash and they had to leave. That's Irene Ano-Frempong. She's Director of Research and Innovation Forum for Research and Innovation for FARA. So, Elena, would you like to come on and introduce yourself a bit and maybe give a few reflections from your perspective? What are you taking away from this discussion so far in terms of your own work and where you think we should be driving this debate?
Yeah, thank you, Peter. This has been an exciting session. And just a little bit to introduce myself, I work for the Forum for Agricultural Research. This is a forum that brings together 4 sub-regional bodies, Sasereka, Koraf, Kadesa, and Nazru in the different corners of Africa. And we work to support national systems in strengthening the application of science to bring food to the table, translate what is in research to the table. So this topic is really central to what we do. And 2-3 key things that really came up that I'm very, very happy and I think it needs mention and reiterating.
I think Irene's camera's frozen. Is that just for me?
It's for me as well. I'm going to try to turn off her camera and see maybe her internet isn't strong enough to handle the camera.
Irene was getting to the point where she was going to make a major point. What a pity. The online conference nightmare. Irene, you're now muted.
Irene,
Okay.
we're getting a little connectivity issue. So unfortunately, I might ask you to turn off your camera just so the internet
My camera,
is reserved
okay.
for the audio,
fine.
so we don't
That's
lose
fine.
Yeah. So
That's
Irene,
fine. So
you just done your introduction and you're just saying what I think is, and that's when you froze.
Oh,
so
man.
Recap.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I was starting with the point Jemima made on the fact that small-scale farmers are not the same. That's a crucial point. That we need to recognize the heterogeneity and be able to deal with the different support systems that we need to provide for the different categories. But overlaying that is the fact that across the categories, we also have the vulnerable group, or let's say the risk-averse group, actually also wanting to move up the ladder to become commercial. So we need to pay attention that, you know, there's also a dynamic flux of movement across the different categories that she nicely put together. We did, as far back as early 2000, we were doing lots of livelihood studies, and in Ghana, for instance, where we characterize farmers, we realized that the most risk averse are the ones that also are wanting to move up the ladder to become commercial. How do we support even the risk averse that Jemima feels, oh, they need social protection? But a lot of them also want to move up the ladder. How do we make sure that they join maybe the next group that require linkage to mainstream markets? You know, so that's a point that we need to pay attention to. The second point that I felt was very interesting and important was the point made by Julio around the need to look at the food system in general. If you look at the shifts that are occurring in food systems, you look at Africa, Africa has only 2 components within the food system, 62% farming and everything else, 38% there. If you look globally, only 22% of the food system is farming. And we have as much as 23% in input supply, 25% in retail, 15% in processing, and 15% in logistics. that tells you one thing, that if we want to take advantage or we want to make a small-scale farmer count in the future, and also link to the issue of the key actors like women and youth, we need to pay attention to the aspects that involve women and youth in terms of value addition, processing, logistics, retail. Those are areas that in Africa has been very difficult to look at in terms of wanting to improve the environment that one of the speakers rightly pointed out. How do we improve this environment that helps not just the general small scale, but the women and youth that form the major bulge in Africa, take advantage of that. The third, that is also linked to the food system, is the link to nutrition. Agriculture and nutrition is becoming, the linkage is becoming more important, and a lot of emphasis is being played to it. Now, in this conversation, how do we ensure that linkage, between agriculture or small scale farmers and efforts on nutrition, enough effort is made? And again, if we do that, we tackle the issue of the vulnerable group, the women and the youth as well. Then, of course, I want to highlight the issue of how do we ensure that science actually plays a big role in dealing with issues of vulnerabilities of these small-scale farmers. More recently, we had looked at the topic of vulnerability, working with Foresight for Food. And I think we see it's important that we look at these scenarios and deal with them before they actually happen. How do we co-create, bring the issue of ownership of the small-scale farmers to the technologies that we develop? And by this, I'm talking about just basic science-led solutions, not sophisticated. Science-led solutions that will help the small-scale farmer to be linked to mainstream markets. And that's another point that I think is crucial. And I will say the main problem of Africa is linkage of the woman small-scale farmer to the mainstream market. How do we deal with those issues of aggregation and logistics and bring small-scale farmers together to make sense of mainstream markets? So I think the big points have been made, and we need to nuance this with the detail that go behind these big points. And of course, the last point to be made is one of data, and I think Jimana makes that very well as well. That it's been difficult to get the data that helps inform the necessary incentives that need to be put in place to influence the environment for the small-scale farmer. So we need to have some effort that helps us collect the gender aggregated data that helps us to inform the incentive structure, whether policy, whether price incentive, or any other incentive that is important to change the environment of the small-scale farmer. So this is exciting, and these are my initial points. I missed quite a bit, but these are the points I will pick up.
Sure. I mean, we can't comment on everything, of course. I'd like to try and link people back together. I don't know if Milu and Avinash would like to put their cameras back on. We lost Julio and Jimina for now. But I was really triggered by, Avinash, by your comment about what you called ultra small farms, ultra small holdings. And I think this is something that actually Milu started off with, really. So many farms which have actually become too small to generate income, but particularly, as he said, to generate agriculture-led growth, yeah? And we still seem to be trapped in this idea somewhere in Africa that agriculture is going to lead the economic development, which I doubt it can do on its own.
So
I'd like
when I
Milu and Avinash, maybe you could both comment on this.
No, so let's start with Milu, then I'll chip in.
Milu?
Yeah, sure, yes. As I said, yes, land is becoming a binding constraint in Africa. And maybe just to share my thoughts about our work. I did a paper in Kenya whereby I was examining sustainable intensification to get to see like in which farms is it possible. And the results I got, and basically this is also being coming out from other countries, is you know, while intensification is possible for smaller farmers, it is becoming exceedingly impossible for farms that measure less than 1 hectare. And in terms of population densities, maybe, let me say, what we saw in this study was intensification in terms of productivity increases with the population density up to around 500 persons per square kilometer. And then beyond that population density threshold, we see productivity coming down. And when you break this one down to like, what does this mean in terms of landholding sizes at the household level? What you see, if you assume each household has like 5 members, this translates to 1 hectare per household. So it means that, you know, when we get into landholding sizes which are below, not landholding sizes, but area operated, which are below 1 hectare per household, we are getting into a very dangerous zone. And what is happening is that in some countries, actually they are already there. Like I said, in Malawi, over 60% of the households in Malawi are operating less than 1 hectare of land. So yeah, that's what it is. And time is running out. Actually, when we get to like less than 0.5 hectare operated, then we are trading on very dangerous grounds. Actually, I don't refer to those ones as farmers. I basically refer to them as near landless. And as Jimana said, you know, we need to get to see what to do about them.
Sure. So maybe to pick up from Avinash. Avinash, I was very struck by the fact you were saying that the registration of these unique identifiers actually could potentially give an opening then for the direct cash transfers. This idea actually that Duflo and Banerjee are really pushing in, that I've just been reading about in terms of the ultra basic universal income, for instance, the direct cash transfers. Would you like to pick up on that and see, maybe explore how applicable would you think that would be also in the African context, in some of the contexts that Mila has been talking about?
So in India, Government of India has started giving 6,000 rupees to every landholder. And during the
cameras on, guys?
My internet was showing unstable. Okay. That's why I switched off the camera. Sorry, apologies. Huh?
We want to hear you.
I'm not being shy, just adjusting to internet speed. So Government of India 2 years ago started 6,000 rupees, which is about $80, $85 US dollars to every landholder, is irrespective of his or her landholding size, as an income support program, and on a very large scale. It's almost now 60% of India's agriculture budget as such. And it has been made possible by farmers having bank accounts and farmers having mobile numbers and this unique social security number type thing called Aadhaar here. And for example, during COVID, what government did is they give 2,000 rupees in 3 installments, but during this crisis, they front-loaded the transfer for this year. So I think wherever you have farmers who have bank accounts or mobile banking, etc., it's doable. The thing that you have to worry about, what hasn't happened in India, is this is an additional subsidy. It has not come after reducing other subsidies that Duflo and Banerjee are suggesting. So it's one more subsidy and like hitting budget constraints. So in Africa or anywhere else, if it substitutes some distortionary subsidy, I think it can be quite good. If it becomes yet another subsidy on already fiscally constrained government, then I think it would eventually become unsustainable. So that's the challenge, the political challenge of just keep adding subsidies without retiring the older ones. I think thank you.
And I think that was mentioned, I think you mentioned it, in fact, this lock-in we have, that it's that's also very hard actually to get rid of those policies in order to enable, if you like, policies which will protect the natural resource better.
I am 43 years old, and in my lifetime, no subsidy in India has been rolled back.
Has been removed. Wow.
Yeah. So that's my sense. Broadly, it might be correct. Yeah,
Yeah,
sorry,
the other link I really liked there was this link as well with digitization, because that was also something that Julio mentioned for Latin America. And I think we often tend to think of digitalization as just a way of pushing out knowledge, but actually, I think there are very different ways that the digital world, in fact, can help those connections. And I think that one of identification and bank accounts and everything is clearly one.
Yeah.
There are so many questions come up. There's no way we can cover them all. And obviously what we're trying to do today is to collect topics for a further discussion. But there's one from Moses, where Moses actually was raising a point that Julio had raised, which is one about smallholder agency and empowerment. I mean, this came back also in the comments from Jimana earlier, definitely. So for Milu and maybe for you, Avinash, how do you see this, Milu, in terms of empowerment and actually giving voice? You know, people are saying, you know, Jim and I have been discussing how do we get a voice from farmers into this discussion, and we welcome suggestions there. But how do we view that whole idea of actually trying to get a smallholder agency, and what sort of policies could we put in place, institutions, to actually support a smallholder voice? I don't know, Milu, if you have suggestions.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I'll give it a shot, and then I will let others kind of try to help out. Yeah, as I said, smallholder farmers are of different categories. What I would want to mention is that, and actually this is a problem that we've discussed about, you know, generalizing all smallholder farmers are. I would think coming with the one size fits all in terms of policy packages might be missing the big idea. So as Jemima said, we have different categories of smallholder farmers. We have those ones who, as I said, operating 0 to 5 hectares, from 0 to 0.5. To me, those ones are more of, as I said, near landless. So we need other safety nets for them. Then we have another class of 0.5 to 1. Those are very much approaching, landlessness too. Yes, they are producing for subsistence, but the biggest problem is, whenever they sell anything to the market, to me, I tend to think they are selling their food, and basically they will be back to the market again. Then we have another group, which is 2 to 5 hectares. I would think there is a huge potential for getting this group commercialized if we get the good policies in place. In terms of, and I think IPRI has done a good work on this front. In terms of, suppose you are to get like $1, where would you get better returns? Is it just investing in fertilizers alone, or do we invest in research and extension to get to see what technologies work for smaller farms? Or that improving infrastructure. If I was just to share just a bit about smaller farming in Nigeria. Yes, I know. Yeah, Nigeria is a land abundant country, and we would want to see, you know, smaller farmers graduating into medium scale farming and to more commercialized system. But what you find is that when I did my study there in 2018, even to get to where these smaller farmers are, I couldn't even use our SUVs. I had to use motorcycles or car to get to where they are. So even if you drone that farmer with fertilizer, even if you give him seeds for free, unless he has a way of accessing the markets, then we are just wasting our time. So we need to consider different farmers and what they need, across the entire spectrum of the farmers.
May I add a quick? I know time is short, but may I add
Avinash, please do go ahead. Yeah.
So I strongly feel that, in the 70s and 80s, this whole debate on giving agency to farmers, too many of these forums take very technocratic approach, and we ignore politics, especially in democratic country and especially in South Asia, but other parts of Asia too, where farmers constitute as an occupational class the majority, right, or a pretty decent majority. it would be interesting to, even in these sort of forums, to bring the dirty, messy electoral politics, because that's the surefire way for them to acquire agency, not for some outsider to giving them. And there are examples. Indian farmers show very informal ways of organizing over vast areas to secure free electricity. It's not a donation. Politicians give it because if they don't, they won't get voted back to power. Or very cheap urea. So how does that happen? I think in the last 20 years, the politics of a small farmer organization has fallen out of disfavor as a discipline that people study. We had a lot of studies. That needs to come back even in such forums. I don't think a UN, a FAO can give them agency, or even a government or a political party. No. These farmers are fighting for it every day, and those need to be studied because there's so many scholars here in this forum. And I think that needs to come back and be part of these forums too, not just the technocratic discussion.
There's a lot of really fascinating comments coming in on the chat. You know, we're really out of time for today. One of the major points for us today was really to try and pull together what are the key issues. Yeah, and I think we've had so much really stimulating comments coming in from our speakers today, and there's a huge amount in the chats. Now, we triggered something. It's something that's going to roll, and I like this very much because it's not something we have to finish today. We're going to be continuing in discussion and debate now up until November, so there'll be plenty of time. What we'll do is we'll take the comments that we've got in the chat and the other questions, and we'll be using those then to highlight issues that we can bring back into discussion further on. And I mean, there are so many we haven't had time to go into here in the discussion around gender, around we touched on this idea of farmer diversity, of infrastructure and the like, of course, and we touched a bit on social protection. But I just want to hand back then to Jim for some final words, but a promise from us that we'll do our very best to pull this together. Watch this space, because we'll be coming back with more activities. Jim, some final words.
Thank you, Ken, and thank you so much to our speakers. And just echoing what Ken had said, I mean, just a richness of inputs and challenging thinking that I think it probably goes beyond our expectations in setting up for this first scene-setting dialogue. I think three really key points came across for me. One is this need that's been said over and over about really recognising that all smallholders aren't the same. So how do we understand the issues there? But I think also particularly how do we get a much better understanding of the opportunities for different groups of farmers in terms of thinking about creative ways forward. I think the point that understanding which markets we're talking about and understanding how important these semi-formal markets are going to remain as you get urbanisation into rural areas, and what are the connections there, and what are the connections between markets and delivering a more nutritious food base for growing urbanised populations, and can we unpack that whole story much better? A really strong point put by Julio. And then I think we come back to some of the issues that were raised by Avinash, and probably that we need to be thinking policy-wise in much more creative and diverse ways, from, and also from the basics about infrastructure through how do you get really creative use of technology in supporting small-scale agriculture. So, as Ken has mentioned, we'll be pulling all of this together. We realise that not everybody will be able to join all sessions. Just a quick run through what the following sessions will be. We deliberately set this session up as sort of a big picture. What are the big challenges? For the session at the end of August, we're going to try and go local and get a whole series of short vlogs that people can try and bring some of these issues to reality for us with short videos. We realise we're in challenging times because of COVID, so how far we'll be able to go, we're not sure, but we're going to do our best. So that's sort of counterposing the big picture today with some real local issues. This is what I'm dealing with when I look out my my back window to see what's going on around me. Hopefully some input from farmers at that point as well. That will take us on into a session at the end of September, where we want to dig more deeply into what's going on in the 3 different regions. And that will then take us into looking at more solutions and looking at what some of the big policy implications would be in the last 2 sessions. We're intending to try and make this more interactive as we move along and break out into small groups in a number of the sessions. And we've also set up a system of having what we've basically called sort of virtual side events. So if any of you say, hey, here's an issue that I'd really like to run a side event on and link it into the big picture, do get in contact with us and we'll see how we can help set that up. We also realize that people probably don't go back and revisit an hour and a half of talk. So we will be turning all of these sessions into short, sharp blogs and summaries so that people can reconnect quickly to the essence of what has been said. So I think that's probably all I need to say. I can see it turning to 14:30 exactly.
We're out of time.
Thank you, everybody, very, very much for engaging with us, and thank you so much to all the speakers.
Yeah. So
Thanks everyone. Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Ken.
Yeah, particularly to our speakers. We're going to try and see if we can get the questions that have been posed that we haven't been able to answer into a form where we can actually draw on some responses as well from our speakers. So hope to see you all online in future throughout this dialogue. Okay?
Thank you.
Bye.